When many people imagine colonial America, they often picture a small number of English settlers arriving and establishing isolated communities that later became the United States. The reality is far more complicated and far more fascinating. From a genetic perspective, early America was one of the greatest population mixing events in human history. Long before Europeans arrived, the continent was home to millions of indigenous peoples representing thousands of years of migration, adaptation, and cultural development. Beginning in the late 1400s and accelerating through the 15th centuries, 16th century and 17th century, European colonization brought people from England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Spain, and many other regions. At the same time, millions of Africans were violently removed from their homelands through the transatlantic slave trade and brought to the Americas. These populations did not exist in perfect isolation. They interacted through trade, warfare, alliances, marriages, coercion, adoption, and the complex social realities of frontier life. Modern DNA tests reveal the biological echoes of these historical events. The ethnicity estimates, DNA matches, haplogroups, and genetic segments we see today are not random. They are the result of centuries of migration, survival, adaptation, and human relationships. The genetic history of America is not a story of one people replacing another. It is a story of many peoples whose histories became intertwined. One of the greatest misconceptions about early America is the idea that Europeans arrived in an empty wilderness. Nothing could be further from the truth. By the time European explorers reached the Americas, the continent had already been home to indigenous peoples for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence, oral traditions, and genetic studies demonstrate a deep history of indigenous presence. Over thousands of years, populations diversified into hundreds of nations with unique languages, political structures, spiritual systems, and cultural identities. In eastern North America, sophisticated networks of diplomacy and trade connected communities across vast distances. Coastal nations traded with inland nations. River systems acted as highways connecting communities from the Atlantic coast to the Mississippi Valley and beyond. This long period of separation and regional adaptation created genetic patterns that can sometimes be detected in modern indigenous DNA. However, genetics must always be understood alongside culture and community. DNA can tell us about biological ancestry, but it cannot define indigenous identity, citizenship, or cultural belonging. For genealogists, this is an important distinction. A person may possess indigenous genetic ancestry while having no cultural connection to a tribal nation, while another individual may be a recognized member of an indigenous community despite possessing little detectable indigenous DNA due to the randomness of inheritance. The English were among the earliest and largest European populations to establish permanent colonies in what became the United States. Beginning with the settlement of Jamestown in 1607 and expanding through New England and the southern colonies, hundreds of thousands of English migrants crossed the Atlantic during the colonial period. These settlers did not represent a single social class. They included wealthy landowners, religious refugees, merchants, craftsmen, indentured servants, laborers, and people seeking opportunities unavailable in England. Because of their early arrival and rapid population growth, English settlers left a disproportionate genetic impact. A relatively small founding population produced millions of descendants. This is an important concept in genetic genealogy known as the founder effect. Early populations with high birth rates can contribute enormous amounts of DNA to later generations. Today, many Americans with colonial ancestry find extensive English genetic connections, especially throughout the South, New England, and parts of the Mid-Atlantic. The Scots-Irish represent one of the most influential migrations in early American history. These migrants were largely descendants of Scottish Protestants who had settled in Ulster, Northern Ireland, during the plantation period. After generations in Ireland, many emigrated to America during the 1700s. Unlike many English settlers who established coastal communities, Scots-Irish migrants often moved rapidly into frontier territories. They became heavily associated with the Appalachian Mountains and the expanding western frontier, carrying traditions involving farming, music, religion, language, and community structures. Genetically, Scots-Irish ancestry can be difficult to separate from other populations from the British Isles because English, Scottish, and Irish populations share significant ancient ancestry. This is one reason why ethnicity estimates may shift between Scottish, Irish, English, or Northwestern European categories when testing companies update their reference populations. German migration was one of the largest colonial settlement movements into early America. Many German-speaking immigrants came from regions devastated by war, religious persecution, and economic instability, particularly areas of the Rhineland and the Palatinate. Beginning in the late 16th century and expanding during the 17th century, large numbers settled in Pennsylvania, creating communities often called the Pennsylvania Dutch. The word Dutch in this context does not mean they came from the Netherlands. It is derived from the German word Deutsche, meaning German. Many of these communities maintained their language, religious traditions, and marriage networks for generations. Because of this, some German-American communities show genetic clustering and identifiable patterns in DNA databases. Today, German ancestry is one of the most common ancestries reported among Americans, even though many families lost the German language and traditions through assimilation. Although smaller in number than the English or Germans, Dutch colonists had a lasting impact on early American genetics and culture. The Dutch established New Netherland in the early 16th century, centered around modern-day New York. Their colony was remarkably diverse for its time, including Dutch settlers alongside Germans, Scandinavians, Indigenous allies, Africans, both enslaved and free, and other Europeans. Many early New York families developed extensive descendant networks that can still be identified through documentary genealogy and DNA matches today. Because Dutch colonial populations were relatively small, many descendants share common ancestors from a limited number of founding families. This can produce a founder effect where certain Dutch colonial ancestors appear repeatedly in family trees. French colonization followed a different pattern than English settlement. Rather than establishing massive agricultural colonies along the Atlantic coast, many French settlers developed communities centered on trade networks, particularly the fur trade. French populations expanded throughout Canada, the Great Lakes region, and down the Mississippi River into Louisiana. French colonists frequently formed relationships with indigenous communities, particularly in the fur trade regions, resulting in many families with both European and indigenous ancestry. The Acadians of eastern Canada later experienced forced removal during the Great Expulsion of the 1700s, with many ultimately settling in Louisiana, where their descendants became known as Cajuns. French-Canadian populations also provide a fascinating example of the founder effect, where a relatively small number of original settlers produced millions of descendants. This creates extensive DNA matching networks among French-Canadian descendants today. No discussion of America's genetic history can be complete without acknowledging the enormous impact of the transatlantic slave trade. Beginning in the early colonial period, enslaved Africans were brought to North America and other parts of the Americas through systems of forced migration and human exploitation. These individuals were not a single population. They represented hundreds of ethnic groups, languages, and cultures from regions across West and Central Africa. The brutality of slavery intentionally disrupted family connections and cultural continuity. Names were changed, languages were suppressed, and generations of ancestral knowledge were lost. Yet despite these efforts, African Americans preserved and transformed cultural traditions while creating new communities and identities. Genetic genealogy has become a powerful tool for many African American researchers because DNA can sometimes reconnect descendants with regions of Africa, distant cousins, and ancestral communities that were separated by slavery. However, DNA cannot fully restore every lost name or story. It must be combined with historical records, oral histories, and community knowledge. The frontier was not simply a line moving westward. It was a constantly changing zone of interaction between peoples. European settlers, indigenous nations, and African populations encountered each other in complex ways. Some communities formed marriages and family alliances. Indigenous nations adopted outsiders into their communities. European traders lived among native communities. Enslaved Africans escaped and sometimes joined indigenous or frontier communities. Other interactions involved violence, displacement, warfare, and systems of inequality. This complexity is precisely why genetic genealogy can sometimes reveal unexpected ancestry. A family that has identified as English for 300 years may discover an African or indigenous ancestor hidden within their family history. Likewise, A family with a long oral tradition of Indigenous ancestry may discover that the biological pathway is more complicated than expected because DNA inheritance is random, and not every ancestor leaves detectable DNA. The absence of DNA does not necessarily mean the absence of an ancestor. One of the most misunderstood aspects of DNA testing is the expectation that every ancestor contributes equal amounts of DNA forever. They do not. Each generation, your DNA is shuffled through a process called recombination. You receive approximately half your DNA from each parent, but beyond that, the amount inherited from each ancestor becomes increasingly variable. By the time we reach the 5th, 6th, or 7th great-grandparent level, many ancestors may have contributed no detectable DNA at all. This is especially important when discussing colonial ancestry. Someone may have a documented Indigenous African, English, or French ancestor in the 1600s and not inherit a detectable DNA segment from that individual today. Genealogy and genetics are two separate but complementary tools. Records tell us who our ancestors were. DNA tells us which pieces of those ancestors' genetic material survive the random lottery of inheritance. The true genetic history of early America is not a neat collection of separate boxes. It is a living mosaic created by thousands of years of Indigenous history, centuries of migration, forced displacement, cultural exchange, survival, and human relationships. The DNA we carry today is a biological archive of those journeys, but DNA is only one chapter of the story. The names recorded in old documents, the traditions preserved by families, the oral histories passed through generations, and the communities that continue to maintain their identities are equally important pieces of our shared past. As genealogists, our responsibility is not to force history into simple categories. It is to follow the evidence wherever it leads, to respect different forms of historical memory, and to recognize that every family story exists within the larger human story.